The Song of the Lioness Quartet by Tamora Pierce. Alana, the First Adventure, published 1983. In the Hand of the Goddess, published 1984. The Woman Who Rides Like a Man, published 1986. And finally, Lioness Rampant, published 1988. And if these books look a little old and beat up, that's because they are. These are the original copies that I had and read as a kid 25 some odd years ago. These are printings from the 1980s. Just wanted to pull out and kind of go back to a little nostalgic favorite for the first time and probably getting close to 20 years in between kind of some longer and heavier books. Mix things up a little bit. The series centers around the titular Lioness, Alana of Trebond. She's kind of a likable fantasy protagonist and kind of the plucky, young, enthusiastic Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter kind of mold, like them. She could be a bit fiery and tempestuous, but she's also determined, a dreamer, and wants to do the right thing for herself and her friends and the betterment of the world. As the saga begins in Alana, the First Adventure, we start with Alana and her brother Tom, both about 11 years old, in their home country of Trebond. Alana of Trebond, her full name is. And she is to be sent off to a temple to learn to be a proper lady of nobility, a lady of high society, which is her worst nightmare, essentially. And her brother, Tom, is to be sent to a military academy, basically, in the royal capital to become a knight. Also, his worst nightmare because he wants to become a sorcerer, and she wants to become a knight. So, she and her brother initially switch places to fool the servants who were taking them out of the city. She pretends to be Tom. He pretends to be a girl because they look so much alike at the age of 11 that they can pull this off. And soon after, her manservant Coram discovers, that same night that it's not Tom, it's Alana he's leading. But he agrees to go along with it and help her disguise herself as a boy named Alan and enter the kind of Knights Academy as a girl disguised as a boy. And so that's kind of our central hook for the first couple books, at least, is Alana training as a knight in these two books while disguised as a boy the whole time, which becomes more difficult, obviously, the more her and her male classmates mature. The two books, or the four books, I should say, are divided into two relatively distinct kind of two-book arcs that are quite different from each other. The first, with the training, the night school, the gender hiding, is a very kind of clear and clever concept that really drives the action and the protagonist forward in a consistently kind of compelling and fun and likable way. The latter two, the narrative gets a little more mushy and vague, but we'll get to that in a little while. There's no need to rush into that. But these first two books, they mostly take place in and around the capital city and the royal palace where they train the knights, give or take a handful of field trips. Book one in particular is very training-centric. It goes into a lot of detail in Alana's very long and trying days and years of being a trainee and a page for her first 4 years of Knights Academy, roughly. It goes into how she has hours of classes every morning in kind of a classroom setting where she learns about the history and of the world and science and mathematics and battle tactics and reading and writing, which she already knows how to do as it starts, and chivalry, followed immediately also for hours every day by going outside and having drills on combat, strength training, wrestling, sword fighting, archery, horseback riding. Followed on top of that by hours every day of having to be a page in the palace, of serving meals, assisting people with whatever they need assistance with, assisting the knights and squires and lords and ladies and whatnot. And then Alana personally assigns herself even more work after all that every night, additional sword training and strength training, simply because she has trouble, as a girl, keeping up strength-wise with lots of her classmates. So the book it's very much a testament to a lot of really hard work, because that's basically the first half or so of the book. Once we get to the kind of royal palace and the knight training school. It's mostly just kind of what I described. It's endless hard work and endless long days, long weeks, long months, long years of training. And it certainly has kind of a feminist message, but I would say it's kind of a old school of feminism. It's not so much the kind of validating feminism we tend to see with a lot of female genre protagonists these days, where it's you don't have to train, you don't have to worry about it, you're already super skilled, you're already perfect, nothing can stop you, you have no meaningful obstacles, you're the best, you were always destined to be the best, you're always born to be the best. That's what I call kind of validating feminism, whereas this is more of old school. It's more aspirational in nature. It's more about this is what you can achieve with a hard work and a strong spirit, and it does so without needing to put in a bunch of like cringy, kind of preachy, sexist antagonists for her to go against. Obviously, there's some of that, as would be the case, but it's feminist, but in a likable, positive, and a proactive way that I think any reader could get behind. This first book in particular, it's fairly episodic in nature, with most of the fairly lengthy chapters, and I mean lengthy relative to the overall length of the book, which is only in the 200-page realm. It's definitely not a doorstopper by any stretch of the imagination, but there's only a handful of chapters, and it seems like most of them center around one major obstacle or another. For example, in one case, there's a class bully, essentially, named Rallon of Malvin, who Alana has trouble with for over a period of months. He keeps he thinks she's Alan, the boy, but he keeps beating the shit out of her, basically. And it's about her kind of training and getting stronger and learning how to fight and wrestle to take him on. There's another chapter about where a plague sweeps through the city and is basically killing a bunch of people in Alana's efforts to help save her friend Prince Jonathan from the plague. You know, there are likable supporting characters, including Prince Jonathan, who I just mentioned, who's despite the fact that he's royalty, is going through the same training as everyone else and kind of becomes to be closer to Alana, much closer in future books. And George Cooper, a thief in the city who also becomes a major ally and friend of Alana through the series. Her mentor, Coram, who I mentioned earlier, and some other classmates. In truth, a lot of the kind of supporting characters kind of blend together and are extremely distinct, but I'd say the main arc of the book is less about Alana's relationship with any other particular character and more just about her own development, her development as a knight, as a soldier, as a swordswoman, and her various trials in hiding her gender, which, goes into detail about like her first, how she has to hide her first period, It goes into those sorts of details about her not swimming naked with all her classmates for obvious reasons and that kind of thing. And it's an interesting hook because it has that double life appeal that we see in any, you could compare it almost to like a superhero narratives where they have their double lives as their real world identity and their superhero. He or she has her own double identity as Alana and Alan, where she has to present two sides to the world, and it goes into detail in all the various ways she has to hide the truth while kind of training with everyone else and having to do extra work on account of, not having the same testosterone, the same muscles, et cetera, et cetera. So it throws a lot of stuff at you and keeps it brisk and keeps it moving and interesting all through a fairly short book that's pretty well structured, if episodic, as I said. It's fun to read in the same way that most training narratives are fun to read and to watch. I call it kind of the Full Metal Jacket effect, right? Where people might like the training half of it better, at least speaking for myself. I don't presume to speak for everyone, but it was also the case in a book I reviewed on Zio's book club a few months back called Blood Song, where also took place at kind of a military academy where, for me, the superior half of the book was the training half rather than the actual going to war half afterwards. And in the same way, I kind of find it compelling here. I like watching all the development of skills, her bettering herself one day at a time in the sword and with the horse and the bow, and so on and so forth. The weakest part of this particular book, that is not the whole series, but Alanna, the first adventure itself, I might say, is actually maybe the last chapter, where Alanna and Prince Jonathan end up in this kind of mysterious black city of spires and pillars, and they fight these demons called the Ysandir. It's not that it's badly written or unexciting as a climax for the book. It's just that it all feels very Diablos ex machina, just villains out of nowhere. They're not really built up to. We don't really have a good context for what these demons are in this world. They're never really followed up on in the rest of the series. It seems like a big deal that this city full of powerful, magical, immortal demons exists, and that our characters do battle with them. But no, it's never really particularly followed up on again. I don't know if anyone watching this has ever played the video game Final Fantasy IX. It has a very strange ending where a new villain named Necron shows up out of nowhere to fight you right at the end of the game. This kind of reminded me of this in a way, where these demons just kind of show up so we can have a final battle, rather than because the plot really kind of seems to motivate them to show up. But, it does serve to kind of draw Alanna and Jonathan closer, and so it works as a climax if it's feels a little, I guess I'd say, unrealistic from the rest of the book. I mean, obviously it takes place in a fantasy world where magic exists, so none of it is realistic per se, but even in the context of that, the ending feels a little strange. But besides that, it's a very enjoyable and brisk read. I bet a lot of people could get through it in like 2 sittings, just because things keep moving and it's entertaining. Book 2, In the Hand of the Goddess, largely continues Book 1's narrative at the training in the royal palace to be a knight and hiding her gender and so on. This time continuing roughly from ages 14 to 18, all the way up to when they become actual knights. They graduate from squirehood to knighthood at 18. There are 2 major conflicts in this book, and they feel better contextualized within the world of the Alanna saga than the demons at the end of Book 1 did. The first major conflict is kind of this, it's basically involves a war over kind of this riverbank, kind of towards the middle act of the book. Much of it is taken up by this everyone, the army, the squires, the knights, the pages, all have to ship out to this river to kind of protect it from sort of an invading army from another kingdom. And Alanna, of course, gets swept up in this war. She's supposed to only be there as a squire to serve, but of course she gets more wrapped up into it, ends up in battle, tries to heal people in the tents afterwards, ends up in sort of a hostage situation. And it feels much more realistic. I do quotes because, again, it does take place in a fantasy world and involves the magic and whatnot. But compared to the demons, it feels more realistic because it reflects sort of the ugliness of war. And Alanna getting in real, like, sword to sword, sword to axe, blood splattering conflict, seeing the aftermath of this in tents full of dying soldiers. And it definitely feels more of a piece with the world that we're exploring than the demons in Book 1 did. And it makes for a compelling middle section of the book. And 2, the second conflict in this book is the increasing escalation of hostility between Alanna and Duke Roger, a sorcerer who's in line for the throne, who Alanna has met and suspected foul play of since later on in Book 1. And that conflict continues to escalate here, in particular as we move on past the war section of the book towards the final act. One interesting thing about this book, and I guess the greater series, but I'd particularly hone in on this book, is how upfront about it is about issues of puberty and how Alanna has to hide her gender in regard to those issues. For example, I mentioned getting her period. She also has to bind her breasts down. The book goes into that, and even development of sexuality, in a sense. Basically, Alanna gets pretty horny during these books. I mean, I'm being pretty blunt about it, but part of the thing is that the book actually is too, which I thought was kind of interesting and impressive. It's not like it describes, goes into like the thrusting details of sex scenes or anything. It's, it's all PG-13, fade to black type stuff, but the book is also pretty upfront about, Alana becoming sexually active and enjoying fucking with regularity as she gets into her later teen years in this book. And and it'll continue to be upfront about this through the rest of the quadrilogy. I'm actually surprised, maybe in a sense. I've never heard anything about this book being challenged or censored through the 80s, the way that like Judy Blume books were, for example. And which is kind of funny because, I mean, I've read a few of those Judy Blume books. This is roughly the equivalent in terms of acknowledging the existence of sex, but doing it in a tasteful fade to black type way. But I guess these ones skated under the radar. It didn't even get censored in the same way as Harry Potter in the 2000s, which is funny because Harry Potter plays it way more coy and PG rated with sexuality than these books do. But anyway, moving on from that back into the fantasy adventure, I would say that In the Hand of the Goddess does introduce a few elements I find somewhat questionable. We meet in this book a literal, human-shaped talking personification of this world's goddess who comes and personally takes interest in and speaks to Alana, which, I don't know, it kind of is a little too chosen one-y, like Alana is the special one, which I could live without that kind of thing. It's overplayed in fantasy, and it's not like a huge thing. It's just a matter of a few pages in the book, but I was still kind of reading that, kind of going, nah, that's not really what I want. We also Alana gets a talking cat, a magical talking cat named Faithful, who will continue to be a major character through all the rest of the books, which is fun, and it's not an unlikable character, the way Faithful calls Alana out on her shit sometimes, but it does seem a little bit like something from a Disney movie. But that's mostly nitpicking. There's two kind of bigger issues I have with this book, and actually the whole series before and after this point, which will become even bigger issues in book 3 maybe, which I feel like I should address now. Issue number 1 is how this series consistently sidesteps mystery and surprise in terms of plot twists, who's really on which side, motivations, and so on. What I'm talking about specifically is the villain of this book in particular, and really the overall saga, the aforementioned Duke Roger. Yeah, you got your big fantasy villains. You got Voldemort, Sauron, Palpatine, and Roger. We got Roger. He's the ultimate evil here. But he's... because in universe, Roger is a secret villain, right? He presents himself as a well-liked nobleman. People like him, respect him. He's on good graces with the king and the royal family. But Alana dislikes him from the very first appearance. And his villainy is so just unsubtle, so blatant, so like sneering and over the top, that it's kind of like if we were meant to think that Jafar in Aladdin was not really the villain or something like that. It's like we meet Roger, it's like, okay, here's the villain. And I think it might have been a stronger narrative if Tamora Pierce had played it a little closer to the chest with that. Maybe let there be some kind of a revelation or twist there, so it wasn't... It's all just a little too blunt, a little too black and white the way it's presented now. And it doesn't allow us to really experience the reveal of Roger's villainy the same way that the world does. But that's actually the more minor issue of the two kind of issues I have with this series. The second one would be Alana's magical power, which I don't think I mentioned until now because it seems very perpendicular to the knight training and the sword training and the horse training and the battle training that the books mostly center around. And her magical power, it's not only a lot of potential, but it is so developed and robust from the first page of the first novel when she's 11 years old, that she already has healing magic beyond 99% of mages in this world. And it does feel kind of validating, the validating feminism I mentioned, where it's I shouldn't say that actually because Tom has the same power as her brother, but it doesn't feel developed the same way that her knight training does. It takes away from our investment in her as a warrior because she already has all these other powers and other abilities. She can light candles, move things with her mind, heal people from the plague in the first book. as like an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, she can already do all this stuff. And this aspect actually kind of gets worse as the series goes on. We start leaning more heavily into her wizard abilities than her knight abilities. And it doesn't feel like what the series sells itself as or what it should be. It almost makes me feel like Tamora Pierce had two ideas, maybe. Like one for a series about a girl in disguise as a boy training as a knight, which is kind of what this kind of mostly is, and another about a girl who's a wizard, and smushed them together like chocolate and peanut butter in a Reese's cup. But I don't know. I'm not quite on board with it. I could honestly live without Alanna having any magical powers whatsoever, going up against wizards like Duke Roger, having to use her mind and her sword and her wits, rather than having her own well of magic to fall back into. So that's probably my biggest issue with the entire series. But overall, despite those issues, which I just mentioned, this book in particular is a very brisk, very fun, very enjoyable read. It spaces out its action and battles and character development and training sequences and romance very well onto each other, one flowing into the next in a consistently entertaining manner. The final quarter or so of the book, the final 50, 60, 70 pages, where so many like climaxes and reveals that we've been building up to since the beginning of page 1 of the first book in regards to Alanna's knighthood, her secret of her gender and hiding it from everyone, her rivalry with Duke Roger. These things all just kind of escalate and come together in just a escalating stack of climactic sequences, with something big that we've been building up to for the whole series up to this point happening seemingly every few pages for like a good long stretch of a couple few chapters. It's by far the best stretch of the entire series. It feels like the epic season finale of like a great TV season. So that's why this is my favorite book of the series. I'll spoil that now for my rankings at the end. And in particular, the last quarter or so of this book is my favorite part of this book. So that's good stuff. In the Hand of the Goddess, very nice young adult fantasy novel. Now, having said that, book 3, The Woman Who Rides Like a Man, it's a bit of a strange one, I'll be honest. It takes the series in a completely different direction. It leaves behind the setting and the vast majority of the cast of the first 2 books to do something quite different. So Alanna, now a spoiler alert, I guess, for where the first 2 books go, now a knight. She and her helper, manservant dude friend, Korem, they go into this great southern desert to get away from the drama in Chorus, the capital city, and they end up being abducted by, and then after a duel to prove her worth, accepted by this kind of Arabian Nights meets Native American-ish desert tribe called the Bloody Hawk, one of a group of greater tribes in this whole desert called a race called the Bazir. And although it precedes any of these movies, so I'm not claiming it ripped them off or anything like that at all. The story structure will be instantly familiar to anyone who's seen Dances with Wolves, The Last Samurai, Avatar, any of these similar stories with Alanna gradually being at first a captive of, then kind of an outsider to, and then warming to, and then gradually friends with, and part of, and eventually part of the leadership of this tribe of desert folk. And, I have nothing against all this. It's enjoyable to read. I was reading good chunks of it in each sitting. What's kind of weird about it is just how completely and totally disconnected it feels from the 2 books that preceded it and the 1 book that follows it. It's almost a whole new cast. Most of the characters from the first book's not appearing in this one, and most of the characters introduced in this book not continuing on into the 4th and final book, Lioness Rampant. It's it's weird. It's this very standalone thing with a whole new setting and new characters, new adventures that don't intersect for the most part with anything before or after. It's a strange way to do things. It's almost like a prototype book of what could have, been a series of, 5 10, 15 more Alana books, kind of standalone Alana adventures, where Alana, now a young adult knight in her 20s, goes to new lands, meets new people, has new adventures, and then moves on to the next story in the next book, like a Wandering Ronin type thing, which, would have been fine. I would have been happy to read a few more like this. What's strange is how it's just the one book like that, just kind of smacked in the middle of what is kind of an otherwise connected trilogy formed by books 1, 2, and 4. The end of the book also kind of fizzles out too. It's the story of Alana and the Bloody Hawk is basically comes to its conclusion about 3/4 of the way through the book, and then we switch points of view for a while to Alana's thief friend from the capital city, George Cooper, and his adventures with his kind of rival thief, Claw, for a while. It's takes up just enough pages that it's more than like a brief interlude, but it doesn't quite feel like a meaty subplot either. It's just kind of like, oh, I guess we're following this dude for a little while. Kind of weird. Not quite what we were doing the first 3/4 of the book. And then Alana and Coram go on a sort of errand on the very last chapter that's also disconnected from everything having to do with the Vizier and the Bloody Hawk. So it feels like something more to set up book 4. So it's kind of a shakily structured, not quite cohesive novel in that way. And I already mentioned this before, yet another problem, more prominent still in this book than it's ever been in book 1 or 2, is how Alana's knight training is largely put aside after spending 2 books on it. And here her role in the Bloody Hawk is mostly as a wizard, a shaman, training the next generation in magic use. And it almost feels in a way more like a sequel to a different book where Alana was more a wizard than a sequel to her like training to be a knight for 8 years. So as you might be able to tell, this is my least favorite of the quartet. It's not, I still wouldn't say it's bad per se. It's kind of a fun sort of fantasy, dances with wolves, and in one instance I think I read close to 100 pages in one sitting, so I obviously didn't hate it, or I would have closed the book and played some video games instead. But it's more just like it's kind of a B- sort of deal, maybe a C+ if I'm feeling less generous. But yeah, this one, it's kind of weird. Didn't hate it, but I certainly didn't love it either. And finally, book 4, Lioness Rampant. It's the longest, the darkest of the quartet, has the most character depth, slightly more mature themes than the first few in certain ways. The first half of the book largely revolves around Alana and some of her crew, including a new martial arts character named Liam Ironarm, who, yes, Alana does fuck because Alana horny. They're all together on a quest up a mountain to get a powerful artifact called the Dominion Jewel, which I believe you can see Alana holding on the cover of that book there. I'll admit the Dominion Jewel itself is a bit of an uninspiring and simplistic MacGuffin. It doesn't have the forbidden fruit aspect of something like the One Ring, where its nature makes it too dangerous to use. It's just kind of this awesome jewel that gives you all kinds of badass psionic magic powers, and that's pretty much all there is to it. It feels a little underdeveloped in a way. But after that, Alana returns to the capital city and discovers that her brother Tom, who is now a powerful, mighty sorcerer, has been a bit corrupted by his own power and delved into some deep magics he shouldn't have, and ended up reviving a certain dead character from earlier in the series who now comes back into play. Things escalate. There's some conspiracies around trying to assassinate the king, and things all kind of come together in a giant kind of final battle sequence in the palace, where most of the good guys and most of the bad guys from throughout the series, or at least I should say from throughout books 1, 2, and 4, because as I said before, 3 is weirdly disconnected, all kind of go at each other in a big final battle to save the kingdom from evil. And it's, enjoyable to read a final battle. Once again, Alana's underdeveloped magical powers are come a bit too much into play. They're too central to the climax compared to how I would have liked, as opposed to her much more thoroughly developed in knight training. But so Lioness Rampant, it enjoyable fantasy adventure yarn. Read through it no problem, never wanted to put it down and not come back to it, but it's probably the most kind of generic adventure fantasy of the series at the same time. You know, it has a journey up the mountain to find a magical artifact, a kind of generic love triangle situation, battling evil wizards, very kind of white hats versus the black hats, good versus evil. You know, speaking as someone who's read quite a bit of a generic kind of Tolkien ripoff, Tolkien wannabe 80s fantasy in my day, I would say this is, alone among these books, this is one that probably kind of feels like it slots into that kind of Dungeons-y, Dragons-y type genre. Feels more akin to a lot of those Tolkien ripoffs than it does the first two books, which had that great hook of Alana, you know, disguising herself as a boy and training as a knight. This one doesn't quite have that same hook. It's more about finding magical artifacts and fighting evil wizards. So if you couldn't tell from my review, overall I would rank the books number 2, In the Hand of the Goddess, number 1, Alana the First Adventure, number 4, Lioness Rampant, and then finally at the bottom, number 3, The Woman Who Rides Like a Man. I do like that, unlike, say, Harry Potter, just to grab an obvious fantasy example, we do actually follow our heroine beyond training, beyond school, and into kind of her adult life. But at the same time, what follows the training is probably lesser than the training in terms of narrative drive and hook and how compelling it makes its protagonist. But she is a compelling protagonist. I haven't talked that much about most of the supporting characters through this entire review. Hell, there are major ones consistent through the whole series that I haven't even mentioned once, I don't think, like Sir Miles, Alana's kind of mentor at school turned adoptive father. Don't think I mentioned him, and several others on top of that, but that's because Alana is so dominant of the narrative and such a likable and compelling protagonist. It's because of how deeply you invest in her and her growth and her journey that it carries you through books 3 and 4, even once we're beyond kind of the main hook of training to be a knight. In a way, I wonder if it may have been a missed opportunity for the series to not have more standalone adventures like book 3. I said that as someone who doesn't like book 3 as much, but you know, I could easily imagine an alternate world version of the Alana series where that we ran for, you know, 10 books instead of 4, with books 1 and 2 being the same, and then way more standalone adventures throughout various lands, like The Woman Who Rides Like a Man, before we return to Chorus for the final battle in book 10 or whatever. If we'd had that, I feel like it would have stood out less strangely to get so far away from the narrative of Duke Roger and the chorus and the drama over the, you know, the throne there. But that's not to be. These books were published a very long time ago. The first couple, in fact, before I was born. And so I'm just kind of imagining things that aren't and never will be at this point. But overall, I did still enjoy reading this series, just like I enjoyed reading it when I was youngin' in grade school. Particularly the training parts. It's definitely kind of, you know, for young adults, and it's fairly simplistic themes and broad characters and good versus evil and kind of short book lengths. And at the same time, maybe it's not for the littlest kids because of how upfront it is with the sexuality, but then again, I did read it when I was a little kid, and I don't think it corrupted me too badly, so whatever. But my biggest problem with it, as I said, is probably the underdeveloped kind of wizard magic elements, which, as I said before, they probably could have cut most of that for Alana entirely, and because it's mostly just kind of used as a deus ex machina, so yeah, maybe that's my big issue with it. But overall, you know, on account of the really great hook of disguising herself as a boy for the first 2 books and the likable lead and how enjoyable it is to follow her, you know, growth and her adventures, I will give The Song of the Lioness, with some criticism, very much a thumbs up. Very nice little quartet of books. Enjoyable, fun. Issues, but yeah, I liked it then and I liked it now. And yeah, I definitely, if I ever have a kid one day, I'll show him these. I'll say, here, read some fantasy books from what'll be probably 40 years ago at that point. They're good to get you started in the genre. Anyway. All right, well, that'll sum it up for Zio's book club for now, but I hope to be back pretty soon and catch you on the flip side. Later.